Good evening, everybody. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, we are joined this evening by several members of the Ramsay Centre Board, our chairman, John Howard, Mr. Joe de Bruin, Dr. Michael Eason, also a special mention of our wonderful Ramsay scholars, both undergraduate and postgraduate at our partner universities Wollongong and ACU, who are here tonight. A warm welcome especially to all of you. I'm Simon Haynes. Welcome to our 7th Ramsay Lecture for this year. And by the way, do remember, if you've missed any of the previous 6, we record the live ones for our website, and obviously the online ones are already there, so do have a look. This has been one of the most keenly anticipated lectures in our series, as you can probably tell. I think we're going to need a bigger room. Those of you who are here for the first time, most welcome to you, and do keep coming. Lots more terrific events in store over the coming months. So as usual, I'd like to start by acknowledging the one person whom we at the Ramsay Centre, and of course our good friends and partners at the Ramsay Foundation, the one person that we owe everything to, our wonderful, generous and visionary benefactor, the late Paul Ramsay, without whom nothing that we do at the Centre, the scholarships that we are able to offer at undergraduate, postgraduate levels, the university support for teaching in the arts and humanities faculties, our great book symposiums, our Ramsay writers' poetry readings. We had a wonderful one just last week talking about Elizabeth Bishop, John Keats, George Herbert, and hearing from 2 terrific Australian poets. Our summer schools for high school students in years 11 and 12, or any of these public lecture events, none of that would be possible without Paul Ramsay. His is a truly unique legacy in Australian philanthropy, and we do our very best to honour it and him at all times. So thank you, Paul. Now, I'm not going to take any more of your time promoting upcoming or past events. As I say, this is all on the website. So before I start, all I will say in housekeeping terms is, as usual, you're most welcome to stay back after the event and join us for canapes and drinks, which I think are going to be in that room next door there. Meet our distinguished guest, and do some mingling and socialising after the event. So, we are most privileged and fortunate to be able to welcome as our distinguished Ramsay speaker this evening, Professor Robert Toombs, Emeritus Professor of French History and a Fellow of St John's College, Cambridge. Professor Toombs has served on the Conseil Franco-Britannique, and in 2007, he was awarded the French Palmes Académiques for services to French culture, following the publication just the year before of his classic co-authored book, That Sweet Enemy, L'Ennemi Intime, The French and the British from the Sun King to the Present, a work that's become indispensable, I think, to any modern consideration of Franco-British relations. Maybe even, if I could suggest this, Franco-Australian relations, after the recent awkwardness, if I can put it. Anyway, you know what I'm talking about. I'm delighted to say, by the way, that Robert is joined this evening by the co-author of that book, who is his wife, the French historian Isabelle Toombs, who I believe was, until quite recently, Isabelle, this is right, in charge of French language training at the Foreign Office, doing your best, no doubt, to struggle with the atrocious accents of your students. More recently, Professor Toombs has written The English and Their History, which came out in 2015 with Penguin, which he's just finished revising to bring up to date this year. And it's been called Lucid, Definitive, Transformative, and Delightful. And that was just The Guardian. He's also written This Sovereign Isle, more recently, This Sovereign Isle, Britain in and Out of Europe, which came out with Penguin last year. Professor Toombs is frequently invited to comment on history and politics, including on British, French, and American television, and also in the New Statesman, The Spectator, Le Monde, the Financial Times, the Australian Financial Review, Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, the New York Times, the Times, and the Daily Telegraph. And in August, just 2 years ago, more on today's theme, Robert set up an international group of distinguished historians, and the group's being called History Reclaimed. Its purpose being to combat recent ideological distortions of history, and very successful they have been, though of course la lutte continue. But at that point, I think I'd better leave it to our guest to tell us more. So ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Robert Toombs.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is a great honor and a pleasure to be here. I'm very grateful to be invited by the Ramsay Center, and I'm very grateful to you all for having turned up to listen. I ought, however, to say one thing that you might find amusing. Simon kindly mentioned that I got the Palmes Académiques for co-authoring a book on Anglo-French relations. Isabel didn't get it for the reason that the British Foreign Office, she was at the Foreign Office, follows the principle laid down by Queen Elizabeth I, which is, my dog shall wear no collars but mine own. And civil servants are not allowed to accept foreign decorations. Otherwise, she would have had it, of course. But thank you for asking me. Thank you for being here. Are the history wars worth fighting? People who sincerely consider themselves progressive often deny that culture wars and their variants concerning gender, history, race, free speech, academic freedom really exist, or they dismiss them as the inventions of conservatives who are either paranoid or trying to stir up synthetic controversy. All that is happening, progressives say, is a belated recognition of the dark sides of our past and a more inclusive and equitable approach to minorities and their feelings and safety. I wish this were true, or at least I wish that it was the whole truth. I came rather late to this issue, and I was brought up to date by a succession of fairly minor events in Britain, triggered by the killing of George Floyd in May 2020. Liverpool University denamed a Gladstone building. Edinburgh University denamed a Hume building. There was a campaign to remove statues of Sir Robert Peel. The Westminster statue of Churchill had racist sprayed onto it, and the Cambridge College, named in his honor, held a seminar during which, among other things, it was said that Churchill's ideas, I quote, are the very same ideas through which the Nazis came to power. They're not even parallel, they're the same, right? And Cambridge, my own university, announced an inquiry into its complicity in slavery. Why was I startled by these episodes? I wouldn't be now. Because Gladstone was the greatest liberal politician of the 19th century, Hume, a seminal thinker of the Enlightenment, Peel, the man who gave the people cheap food, Churchill, need I say, the man who did more than any other to prevent global totalitarianism. Cambridge was the university most closely connected with the abolition of slavery, led by Wilberforce and Clarkson. All these men had flaws, that is to say, they were human. To attack figures like Gladstone or Churchill due to distorted historical understanding, or just for the hell of it, is a clumsy attempt to start a nihilistic culture war and offend as many people as possible. It was a wholesale attack, as I realized, on our history, not on its dark side, but on its bright side. Or to put it another way, it was to say there was only to be a dark side, only reasons for shame, apology, and reparation. So as Professor Haynes said, in April 2021, I contacted several other historians and set up a group called History Reclaimed, mainly British, but including significant Canadian, American, and Australian participation. Some of its participants are here. But as the Black Lives Matter furore died down, I began to wonder whether we still had a purpose. Had the hysteria gone away? I'm sorry to say it hadn't, and we do. The editors of our website are retired, myself, David Abelafia, a distinguished specialist in Mediterranean and Oceanic history, and Lawrence Goldman, former editor of the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography and former director of the Institute of Historical Research. Although our two assistant editors, Zoditu Gebre-Yohannes and Alexander Gray, are both young, they are not academics, and hence not subject to internal pressures. We elderly editors are partially a reflection of a generational change within academia, undeniably. Young academics are more woke, but also of widespread self-censorship and intimidation, which means that retired and well-established academics are freer to speak than their vulnerable younger colleagues. I'd like to give you a few examples of cases in which we've been involved in Britain, and which I've selected because they are meaningful in different ways, and I hope that you will think that they have some relevance to Australia too. First example. In 2019, a television program claimed that the treatment of soldiers' bodies in the First World War by Britain was racist. It practiced apartheid in death, was the phrase used. The Commonwealth War Graves Commission produced a hasty report confirming this and apologizing. Yes, they said, their predecessors had shown what they called pervasive racism in their treatment of the Empire's dead. The Ministry of Defense duly apologized, so did Boris Johnson, who was then Prime Minister. When many ethnic minority groups are eager to emphasize their participation in Britain's wars as a buttress to their rightful claims to full national membership, the accusation that the bodies of their dead soldiers were disrespected is particularly hurtful and damaging. Yet careful investigation that we published by Professor Nigel Bigger at Oxford showed that except in one or two marginal and untypical cases, the bodies of non-white soldiers had been treated with respect and usually identically with their white comrades. So what was really pervasive was not racism, but anti-racism. A second example. Several British and other museums, including again in Cambridge, declared that they would return unconditionally to Nigeria the so-called Benin bronzes, said to have been looted or stolen by British troops during an expedition to Benin in 1897. St. Paul's Cathedral even put up a large mural commemorating the then King of Benin as a victim of colonial aggression. But the King of Benin was a slave trader and a killer of slaves. Human sacrifice was widely practiced in Benin. The 1897 expedition was a response to the massacre of an unarmed diplomatic mission. The British stopped human sacrifice and liberated slaves. And to crown it all, a group representing the descendants of slaves today object to the return of these objects to the successors of the slave traders. And History Reclaimed has campaigned on this issue too. Third example. In November 2022, the Wellcome Collection, a museum dedicated to the history of medicine and part of the extremely wealthy Wellcome Foundation, announced the closure of an exhibition of artifacts relating to the history of medicine collected by its founder, Sir Henry Wellcome, because it, I quote, perpetuates a version of medical history that is based on racist, sexist, and ableist theories and language. We strongly criticize this decision as stupid and grotesquely unfair to the memory of a philanthropist of global importance. Fourth example. In the famous Liverpool International Slavery Museum, the impression is given that African slavery was a European invention. Nothing is said about the pre-existence of slavery in Africa, and of the eagerness of African rulers to sell slaves, and no mention at all of the huge trade in slaves to the Muslim world. The kingdoms of Asante and Dahomey are mentioned approvingly, with no hint of their ferocious slaving activity. Yet British abolitionism, an epoch-making development, is hardly mentioned. Here's an example of a taxpayer-funded museum engaged in the distortion and censorship of the past, often presented as giving a voice to marginalized people, yet in a way that could create present-day resentments and grievances. Final example, but there are many, many more. Every week there are more. The Tate Britain Museum recently redesigned its permanent exhibition. In the words of Lawrence Goldman in an article published in The Spectator, I quote, "British history is turned into a narrative of repression. But Britain was a stable liberal society with a representative system of government. It was a haven for radicals and revolutionaries from across the globe. You will not discover this at Tate Britain, where history is simplified and distorted." I mention these cases not because they're unusual, if only, but because they are typical. They show that some of the greatest of our institutions have adopted or surrendered to a negative view of the national past, willing to besmirch the most revered people and events in our history, such as Churchill and the dead of the First World War. And this has become the default position. The worst and most ungenerous interpretations of the past are uncritically accepted and officially imposed. And those whose duty it is to defend our institutions and our history, such as the Commonwealth War Graves Commission or ministers of the Crown, are cowed into apologizing for non-existent sins. Moreover, this default denunciation extends not only to history, but to art and science. As a presentation of the past, it's distorted to the point of falsehood and beyond. Demonstrating the falsehood is easy, but it makes no impression on those institutions, which almost invariably ignore objections. It seems that truth is not something that concerns them. Those who decide what is to be shown and how are, of course, not themselves drawn from disadvantaged groups. They are part of the managerial elite. The efforts which I mentioned a moment ago of the black descendants of slaves to have a say in the disposal of the Benin bronzes purchased with the bodies of their ancestors have been ignored and resisted by supposedly progressive and white museum curators, including in my own university. So politicians, the civil service, educational bodies, churches, charities, museums, art galleries, the BBC, all are complicit or frightened. I realize I'm not telling you things that are wholly new to you. Britain is deeply affected by this trend, but Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and the United States are even more affected, and sometimes in far more extreme ways. The New York Times' 1619 project aims to retell American history as essentially about racism and slavery. Nothing else counts. In Canada, and I'll come back to this a little later, in Canada, it's been asserted that hundreds or thousands of Indigenous children died of cruelty, neglect, or abuse in residential schools. Churches have been burnt down. The Canadian government has paid out vast sums. The Chinese have criticized Canada's human rights record. Yet this story of mass killing of children, which has even been called genocide, to the best of my knowledge, is either fictitious or at best incredibly exaggerated. Elementary historical research by our Canadian members shows it. And the official response? To talk about making denialism a criminal offense. Yes, believe it or not, a Canadian justice minister has said he is open to criminalizing attempts to defend his own country against fake charges of genocide. My heart sank when I read of a similar story in Australia this week. I don't know if it's true or not, but thinking of the example of Canada, I cannot but hope that you will avoid the same kind of debate, well, not a debate, the same kind of scandal. Putting all this together, and there's much more as you know, we have a vast campaign to undermine and demoralize Well, what exactly? The main target is the English-speaking world, with the attack mainly coming from within. The immediate outcome, in the words of the historian and Supreme Court Judge Lord Sumption, is, I quote, a political program for the modern day supported by a highly selective approach to the past, which sees everything through the prism of race. The long-term effect is to discredit the idea of the West, a term which I shall be using as shorthand, as do both its admirers and its critics. The West as the main source over the last 3 centuries of modernity and progress, however uneven. For some, this attack is deliberate and conscious. They see the West as the root of all evil. For others, who may not consciously reject Western ideas, it's merely unthinking collateral damage caused by cultural fashion, what the philosopher John Gray has called a farrago of critical race and gender theories imported from America. For others again, including Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping, it's invaluable propaganda. Crudely simplistic notions of history spread the message way beyond the academic and the purely historical. So we see decolonization, not only of history and literature, but of music departments. After all, Mozart wrote during the period of slavery, of anthropology. One Californian university has closed its museum on the grounds that some of the collection might perhaps belong to some long-disappeared Iron Age indigenous group. Mathematics, art, classics. The Oxford Classics faculty declares itself, I quote, embedded in a 19th century colonial context. Botany. The Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew promises to, quote, tackle structural racism in plant and fungal science. Natural sciences in Oxford are to, I quote, challenge the Western-centric ideas of objectivity, in scare quotes, expertise and merit, and remove structural hierarchies that privilege certain knowledge and certain peoples over others. I hope their engineers are not taken in too much by this, or if they are, that they won't be designing aeroplanes in future. In moving away from a white Eurocentric curriculum, another quotation, many universities are exploring what are called indigenous worldviews. In many ways, of course, that's a very interesting thing to do. But what does it mean? The Open University has promised to include indigenous knowledge and ways of learning rather than the colonizer's perspective. It's unclear what indigenous knowledge means in the British context, but I think we can assume it does not mean the ancient Druids. Though why not? If every culture has its own truth, objective knowledge and reason disappear. So when the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford asked a shaman to choose which objects from its collection had been stolen and should be repatriated, it conceded that Western archaeological methods had no greater validity than mystical divination. There's no agreed name for what is happening. Woke, of course, is the colloquial term, but not very scientific. Other terms are cultural Marxism, which I think is somewhat ambiguous, hyperliberalism, radical progressivism, even the successor ideology. The profusion of terms shows our uncertainty. What are exactly we talking about? Whatever it is, there seem to be several sources. One is intellectual. There is now a revival of Marxist anti-imperialism going back at least to the 1940s, if not to the early 1900s. The wealth of Britain and the West is based on exploitation, slavery, and theft, and so past and present injustice in the world is our creation, and our wealth today is not legitimate. More recent is the postmodernist ideology of the 1960s. There are no objective truths. All grand narratives are tools of oppression. Instead, there are many narratives, my truth and so on. So free speech and debate are suspect as attempts to oppress by argument. How dare you say that my view of the truth may be wrong? These various ideas may be contradictory. Most obviously, they are themselves grand narratives, but logic doesn't matter, they make a heady cocktail. Yet ideas alone do not change history. So a second necessary element is political and ideological. With the collapse of communism as a model, North Korea, anyone? And also of the democratic old left representing the working class, there has been a need to find a new ideology and a new audience for radical politics, a new intersectional alliance of victimized minorities. Hence the so-called identity politics, which uses distorted history, my truth, to create victimhood and perpetuate grievances on account of past events that have no practical relevance to modern lives. Victimhood attracts the upwardly mobile members of formerly disadvantaged groups and their patrons by justifying both psychological and material privileges. But politics needs not only foot soldiers, but also strategy. So the third element is institutions. There's been a rapid takeover, beginning with schools, universities, museums, charities, the things that many conservatives abandoned as less important and less lucrative than law, banking, and business. There seems to be a sort of tacit deal. The left can have culture, the right will have the economy. But now the law, banking, and business too are being taken over, partly impelled by their fear of being seen as against the zeitgeist. Hence the use in advertising and PR of what until very recently would have seemed crazily radical ideas. Activist minorities, with the tide running in their direction, find it easy to silence internal dissent. People are undoubtedly intimidated. But who are the people doing this taking over? This is the fourth element, a greatly expanded professional managerial class, university-educated, relatively young, discontented often, metropolitan, involved in politics, think tanks, often taxpayer-funded NGOs, education, culture, and the growing human resources and compliance departments of business. Some analysts see this as the core explanation of what some call luxury beliefs held by identity liberals, who often reject the nation as a source of evil and adopt new identities. This successor ideology gives them power and legitimacy, allows them to push aside the existing hierarchy, identifies them as part of a newly dominant but virtuous ruling class, and eliminates rivals and dissenters. So a mixture of idealism and self-interest. What could be more powerful? The fifth element, of course, is technology. No need to say much here. New means of communication create a far-flung radical movement, spread its ideas with unprecedented speed, and give it the tools to organize and exercise power while weakening old loyalties and communities. This has developed what David Goodhart has called anywhere people, disconnected from geographical community and from other generations, and adopting, in many cases, new identities. And finally, and I suppose most obviously, and perhaps most importantly, a geopolitical element, the decline or perceived decline of the West. When the Soviet Union collapsed, people looked forward to the end of history through the universalization of Western liberal democracy. It would then have been absurd and futile to attack the triumphant West, its values and its history. But a succession of economic crises, political divisions, military failures, external challenges, and discontents with globalization have made the West a less attractive and less confident model and a less formidable opponent. New grand narratives, to use the postmodernist term, including feminism, the Green Movement, and anti-racism, inevitably undermine the idea that Western history is on balance one of progress and benevolence. So the West is newly vulnerable, and the most corrupt and violent regimes profit from the anti-Western tide promoted by what Lenin called useful idiots within the system. The Chinese have criticized the Anglo-Saxons. A long diatribe recently issued by the Russian Foreign Ministry against British, quote, colonial and post-colonial crimes welcomes what it calls the shift of the agenda to the left, making the discourse on revising the colonial legacy relevant. And it concludes that support for anti-colonial initiatives and continuing attention to this issue in the media and diplomatic environment could have a positive practical effect. I'm sure the Wagner Group wholeheartedly agree. Post-colonial states avoid responsibility for their failures by blaming colonialism, and pre-colonial tyranny is passed over in silence. This is not then just a matter of academic debate. creating a historical narrative is at the heart of a deadly serious ideological and political contest. From Putin to Black Lives Matter, the anti-Western critique is based on interpreting our history as a story of oppression, exploitation, slavery, racism, genocide, and injustice. One might say this is nothing new, even if one-sided. After all, it was Edward Gibbon in the 18th century who wrote famously that history is indeed little more than the register of the crimes, follies, and misfortunes of mankind. The difference is that we're not being offered Gibbon's philosophical conclusion that as a species we are generally pretty dismal. Today's radical narrative stigmatizes only one part of humanity, Europeans, and especially the Anglophone world. They, we are told, set out to conquer the world in the early modern period, practicing genocide and slavery in order to loot. They did so by invasion, dispossession, and colonial rule, which reduced other and better civilizations to servitude and poverty, or destroyed them by genocide. They invented racism to justify exploitation. Their industrial wealth is derived from slavery, and moreover, it began the process of ecological ruin that threaten us all. So all claims that Western values are in any way exemplary must be rejected. The West must repent and pay reparations, and formerly subject or still subjected groups deserve special treatment to redress past wrongs. This narrative has some elements of truth, as we all know. Some indigenous peoples certainly suffered and still suffer. Many were subjected to authoritarian rule, sometimes brutal and exploitative. But the narrative systematically removes these true elements from their context, generally falsifies or exaggerates certain features, and systematically omits positives. Slavery, conquest, cruelty, and exploitation have existed throughout history, until considerably diminished by Europeans, and I say with some pleasure, first by the British, to no small degree led by abolitionist students of my own college in Cambridge, Wilberforce, Clarkson, Palmerston, who sent in the gunboats to stop the Brazilian slave trade, Aberdeen, who passed a law making slavers pirates. Non-European societies, far from being gardens of Eden, were at least equally oppressive and often hyper-violent, and European colonization restrained some of that violence by creating systems of law and politics, and in part emancipated many oppressed groups, slaves, women, lower castes, the weak. Third, the expansion of European power was not simply a story of conquest, and certainly not of genocide, which is in fact a very recent and very contestable allegation, but also a story of mutual cooperation and exchange. Non-European peoples widely benefited from contacts with Europeans, economically, culturally, and politically. As Nigel Biggar, another History Reclaim member, sums it up in his brave and brilliant book, Colonialism, A Moral Reckoning, I quote, "If colonial history gives those of us who identify ourselves with Britain cause for lament and shame, it also gives us cause for admiration and pride." This is not, as Biggar emphasizes, to exonerate Europeans from all charges of wrongdoing, for serious wrongs are undeniable, but it is to add light, shade, and proportion, and propose a more fruitful and genuinely educational view of the past than that of the horrible history caricature. Until very recently, few people would have contested this. It's hardly as if it's new and unknown territory. The Oxford History of the British Empire runs into 18 hefty volumes, and its bibliography has nearly 24,000 entries. The success or failure of certain policies, the motivation of actors, the mentality of officials and missionaries, the resistance and the cooperation of subject peoples, all these things are well known and the legitimate subject of research and debate. For example, the American historian Caroline Elkins hastily accused the British in Kenya of genocide because she computed a major loss of population, which she assumed was due to British violence. But another scholar responded that this lower population was in fact due to increased female education, which had caused a fall in the birth rate. The devastating decline of Australia's Aboriginal population in the 19th century has widely been blamed on white settlers, even accused of genocide, but a respectable academic study ascribes it primarily to smallpox brought by Indonesian fishermen. New Guinea came under Australian administration, colonialism, undeniably. But deaths by atrocious violence before colonial efforts to stop internecine warfare were hundreds of times higher than in Western countries and included the wholesale slaughter of children and cannibalism. I could, of course, go on citing examples and counterexamples, but the moral is that the whole story of European contact with the wider world is complex and has many contrasting outcomes, some of them tragic, others triumphant, some beneficial, some criminal, some pretty neutral, some, as even the leading anti-colonial theorist Edward Said wrote, of sympathy and congruence, not of antagonism, resentment, or resistance. In the context of our present history wars, what is at stake is not only the past, but the present. Falsification of the past creates falsification of the present. According to this narrative, violence, exploitation, and racism in the past creates permanent violence, exploitation, and racism in the present. Again, this is a partial truth. We see examples in the Americas and elsewhere too. But partial truth is not truth. I want to give the example of Britain. Much of the teaching in schools and universities concentrates on slavery and colonial oppression, with the implication, and indeed often the outright assertion, that this makes Britain racist today. An independent inquiry, the Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities, reported in 2021 that, I quote, "We no longer see a Britain where the system is deliberately rigged against ethnic minorities. Impediments and disparities do exist, they are varied, and ironically, very few of them are directly to do with racism." The commissioners who wrote this report, overwhelmingly drawn from ethnic minorities themselves, were viciously attacked by anti-racist activists. Yet other studies, including one by the European Union, have confirmed that Britain is overall the least racist country in Europe, based on a wide survey of ethnic minority experiences. Overall, the experience of being discriminated against in any area of life is lower in the UK than in any of the other European countries, and usually by a huge degree. For example, the experience of racial violence is roughly 4 times higher in Ireland and Austria than in Britain. But teaching history as a story of racism buttresses the false account of racism today and can only fragment our society, obstruct the integration of minorities, and undermine any sense of community. This is sufficient reason, I believe, for saying that the history wars are worth fighting. But there's a wider reason, and this concerns the part that history plays in creating a long-term sense of community, not only between ethnic groups, but for society as a whole. I believe that the democratically governed nation-state is the foundation of democracy and of social solidarity. It's odd to have to state this as if it was some daringly radical idea rather than an obvious commonplace, but that's where we are. An essential part is creating what the late and greatly missed philosopher Roger Scruton called a we, united by a shared sense of belonging. A shared history is crucial to creating the we. The French philosopher Ernest Renan, in a famous lecture on the nation in 1882, argued against authoritarianism and in favor of the nation based on willing participation. As he put it, the wish to go on living together. This, he said, depended on the shared possession of a rich legacy of memories and the will to continue to fructify the heritage. Yet this heritage, our heritage, is being angrily rejected and mocked by powerful minorities and even by great institutions. Shared history is certainly only one element in making a democratic nation. Fair treatment in welfare, housing, health, and employment are at least equally crucial. Nevertheless, if we keep trashing our history in what is already an increasingly atomized society, one in which, as the American sociologist Robert Putnam put it, more and more people go bowling on their own, we destroy self-confidence, achievement, trust, even pride. We're heading for what Roger Scruton called a post-national utopia of nowhere, the home of frozen hearts. What History Reclaimed tries to do is not forget awkward aspects of the past, but to urge society to remember accurately, fully, and honestly, and to understand the vital differences between the past and the present, crucial to understanding both our forebears and ourselves. Otherwise, we develop the dangerous arrogance that seems to assume that present-day progressives are the only people in the whole of human history who are both right and virtuous. We reject the crude postmodernist idea that truth is an illusion, and we firmly believe that truth, reason, and objectivity are possible, if difficult. We also, therefore, reject the now commonly held view, held at least by implication, that a range of untested narratives should be presented uncritically with the intention of pleasing noisy minorities, either as a form of marketing for institutions such as museums, or as a form of patronizing therapy for people who are assumed to be too immature to face the truth. But are the history wars already lost? Are the intellectual, social, and political forces imposing the new orthodoxy already in control? I do sometimes feel that we are merely putting our collective finger in a widening hole in the dike. My personal hope is that we represent both rationality and majority opinion, a powerful combination, and I hope ultimately an invincible one. But even if I'm right, I'm not confident I shall live to see it. So far, we've been mainly reacting to an agenda set by others, pointing out inaccuracies and omissions, even succeeding in making minor changes, but the other side hold the initiative. I hope we can begin to set the agenda, but this requires not merely argument online and in the media. It would be naive to think that we can prevail solely by reasoned argument. But it needs a determined attempt to take back some control of institutions. Two of the members of the History Reclaim group, for example, are also involved in Restore Trust, a grassroots members movement within the National Trust, our largest conservation organization. Another HR member is involved with the group Don't Divide Us, which pays particular attention to schools. I've been asked to help select trustees for national museums. At least 2 HR members are already trustees of major museums, and I'm a member of an advisory group working on the school history curriculum. Yet the task is immense. Our only advantage, a small minority within the academic world, is that we speak for a majority in the country and hence have potential political influence. But in Britain, we've only just left the starting post after more than a decade of conservative governments, governments that have shown little awareness or concern about what was happening, until it is perhaps too late. Nevertheless, if there is to be hope of stemming the tide of weaponized history, political action is indispensable, for this is a political struggle. A hopeful sign is the very recent British law to require universities to promote and protect intellectual freedom. The law was passed against the strong resistance of the academic establishment, strongly represented in the House of Lords, and beaten only because the government was encouraged to show some guts. Our other strength is intellectual, and I would dare even to say moral. As I've said more than once, we are advocating full and accurate accounts of the past, the whole truth. We are not trying to combat one form of ideological distortion by imposing another. We are not trying to bowdlerize and whitewash the past. We're not afraid to admit and indeed to document past crimes and failures, but we want the full story, as accurate as expert research can make it. So alongside the horrors of Atlantic slavery, there was the moral struggle for abolition, first of the slave trade and then of slavery, and the major diplomatic and material efforts made by British governments and the Royal Navy to persuade and, if necessary, to force other countries to stop slaving. The anti-slavery department was the Foreign Office's largest department for most of the 19th century. There were British consuls who used their own money to buy and release slaves and used their own houses to shelter escaped slaves. That's a story that needs to be told too. We admit the weaknesses of the British Raj in India, For example, its failure to invest adequately in education and welfare. But we also show that British rule was cheap. It kept relative peace, fostered economic modernization, and ended regular climate-induced famines. We're not trying to ensure that all history has a happy ending. On the contrary, history, among other things, shows how intractable many human problems are. But we propose something very different from the one-dimensional caricature that's both intellectually impoverishing and socially destructive. Just as Britain has a problem in how to tell the history of the empire, America has the problem of slavery and segregation, and Australia, Canada, and New Zealand have the problem of telling the history of settler societies. The history of settlement is the target of the great progressive shibboleths of the present, racism and ecology. It's certainly not for me to tell Australians how to write their own history. I wouldn't dream of trying to do so. But it seems to me that it's only possible to tell the history of settlement in a way that does not merely generate guilt and resentment, if we can regain some confidence in Western values and achievements. If we can be honest about indigenous societies, both their virtues and their failings, and honest about what happened to them after contact with Europeans. And of course, if the present-day social problems of indigenous peoples can be alleviated and their life choices expanded. How to do that is not my problem, I'm glad to say. Lord Sumption said recently in a lecture in Oxford, "Would the world as a whole be a better place if Europeans had never settled in the Americas or Australia? I do not think so," he said. Neither do I, but I fear many people do, or at least say they do. The case of Canada, the genocide of school children, which I referred to earlier, is instructive. If not restrained by rationality, politicized history can do unlimited damage by creating mad and destructive myths of cruelty and genocide, which make real problems and real solutions almost impossible to discuss honestly. On the terrible charges of genocide made against Europeans, the historian Jeff Finn Paul argues that they are usually made on the basis of huge overestimates of native populations, and often based on dubious myths, such as the deliberate spreading of smallpox. He gives a reasoned estimate of the number of natives killed by settlers in the USA as averaging 50 per year, fewer than the number of settlers killed by natives, and far fewer, of course, than in one old Hollywood Western. And in Canada, he says only a few dozen native Canadians were killed over the whole of its history. Is he right? I can't judge. But these things should be properly investigated, like the stories of murdered children in Canada today, and research must not be attacked as denialism. Nigel Biggar, in his book Colonialism, which I mentioned earlier, thoroughly discusses this question for Australia too, and analyzes its large and disputatious literature, and I heartily recommend his book. As I suggested earlier, Britain should be more confident today about telling its story because racial inequalities and prejudices have been addressed. It's striking today that many of the most outspoken defenders of British history and values are themselves from ethnic minorities. Suella Braverman, the Home Secretary, Mauritian in origin, Kemi Badenoch, Minister for Equalities, Nigerian, Trevor Phillips, former chair of the Race Relations Committee and a leading commentator of Guianan heritage, Tony Sewell, chair of the CRED report that I mentioned, who's of Jamaican heritage, Inaya Folarin Iman, a young broadcaster, and chair of the Equiano project, to name but a few. We elderly white male academics of History Reclaimed can't lead this campaign, nor do we want to. But we can provide ammunition, and I assure you we will. Thank you for your attention.
Well, that was wonderful, Robert. Thank you so much. I'm pretty sure that there's a lot of people who would have questions for you, if it's all right. We have up to half an hour for a Q&A. And I should just begin by saying that please identify yourself before asking your question. And if you could, please keep the question short and try to make it a question, not a manifesto. So perhaps I could just, as an icebreaker, Robert, just ask you something, a question that immediately jumps into my mind when thinking of your career as a distinguished historian of France. As well as what you've been talking to us about just now. So much of the vast campaign that you've been speaking about has not even so much the whole West, but specifically the Anglo-West as its principal target. And you know, outside of the obviously hostile state actors, such as China and Russia in this campaign, it's an English-speaking campaign against the English-speaking world and past. Almost exclusively that. I think you'd call it an attack from within. And as you've said, continental European speakers, let alone other international cultures, look on almost in bemusement at the way that the Anglo world is beating itself up in terms of its own past. So it's very useful to have an outside perspective, and yours is a French perspective, possibly in some ways. So, I mean, arguably France is just as complicit or otherwise in its attitude towards colonies and other races as the Anglo races are, and possibly quite a lot less proactive in addressing these things. So why hasn't this sort of self-harming weaponizing of history happened so much in the Francophone world as it has in the Anglophone world? Why is it just on one side? And what do they think? What do the French think of all of this?
Well, I think those are very interesting questions, and which I could spend a long time trying to answer, but I'll try and give a very quick answer. One thing is, I mean, it is testimony to the huge cultural influence of America. Much of this is an import of America, and it shows how much the modern left in the Western world and in the Anglophone world is motivated by anti-Americanism, or at least opposition to what they see as a system created by America. So, I mean, the focus on the Anglophone world is, I suppose, because the present world order is seen as essentially an Anglophone order. So for the French, they don't see themselves quite as part of that. Indeed, they're not quite part of it. France has had its own history wars a few years ago, particularly over the Algerian War. It's had a long Franco-French war, as some have called it, over the experience of the Second World War. But these have tended to be focused on particular events, and rather than being a sort of general attack on the whole of French history. And I would say the difference there is that the French intelligentsia and the French left tend to regard France as somehow theirs, whereas I feel that in the Anglophone world, intellectuals often feel that they're rather marginal to our history, which is not really about them. They're not really all that important in it. Whereas in France, you know, if you're a French intellectual of the left, you can think the whole of French history revolves around people like you, and France is your creation, the revolution or the whole succession of revolutions and so on. And so I think very few people on the French left would attack France. If anyone does, it's people on the French right. Whereas here, I think it's very much more common for people on the right to feel that they've been kind of pushed out of our history and have been constantly marginalized in it. Which to some degree is perhaps true.
True. Well, it's a conversation we could easily continue, but I'm sure there are a lot of questions from the floor. So, where? Absolutely, over there. Is there a question on this side?
So, Dr. Carl Nollis, recovering academic and then later recovering banker. You've raised an interesting lecture regarding culture wars in an academic context. I'm wondering if you have any comment about it in the corporate context. We do see, for example, in Australia, one of our major airlines who sees fit to take a very public political position that at least half their customers would presumably disagree with. Why do we see the corporate sector acting the way they do?
Yes. Well, of course, sometimes they make a mistake, don't they? Sometimes it turns out not to be the PR triumph that they expected. But I suppose in general it's they're feeling that they can please a part of their potential customer base who feel very strongly about these things, and they assume that the rest don't really care all that much, and therefore whatever they say, most people will not take much notice. But it's true that corporations have regarded much of modern radicalism as not being a threat to them, as long as they get on side. It's not like socialism. You know, it would be hard for a bank or a large corporation to support the Communist Party, but it's very easy for them to support the kind of woke causes because it's not going to cost them a penny, and it can distract attention from any bad things that they're doing. They can say, you know, look how progressive we are. The fact that we're doing this, this, and this is something that you don't need to worry about because we've got nice logos and we put up pretty coloured flags. So I feel very cynical about this. I think it is a cynical PR exercise, which to some extent perhaps builds on the sympathies of some of their junior staff. But I think on the whole we should regard it as a cheap trick.
The debanking issue recently in the UK is maybe an example of what the gentleman was talking about.
Well, yes, the debanking of Nigel Farage
and others
rather rebounded on the bank that had done it. But they obviously thought it wouldn't. They thought it'd make them look good, certainly to some of their own staff. Well, there have been publishers too that have broken contracts because their junior staff said, we don't want you to publish this book. And again, they thought it wouldn't hurt them. It would be less trouble to drop an author than to annoy their staff.
Erica, I think we had a question just here.
Philip Wood. Thank you, Professor Toon, very much for what was in many ways a slightly depressing analysis of where we are at the moment. I know you'd be wary of treading into the arena of Australian politics, but if, as the current government has stated it intends to do, the Uluru Statement of the Heart is implemented in full. That comprises a voice, a treaty, and the truth. And focusing on that third argument, the truth-telling, so-called, how would you, as a member of history, reclaim, and somebody who, along with many of us, I suspect, wants to put a positive side as well as a negative side to the history of European settlement in Australia, how would history reclaim go about addressing the so-called truth-telling process in this country?
I think if I could refer to the Canadian case, which I know better, there has been a reluctance to allow serious investigation of accusations that have been made on the grounds that this would offend traditional truth-tellers whose knowledge must not be disputed or even questioned or even investigated. From what I've heard so far about the accusations about the Australian boys' home is that these accusations were to be investigated. And it seems to me that you have to say, this is a line that you have to hold. You have to say if accusations are made, they must be properly investigated. They cannot just be allowed to rest on believing the accuser automatically. I think there's been too much of that in our criminal law. I don't know about here, but certainly in Britain. There have been scandalous cases in which the most unlikely accusations have been believed and people's lives destroyed as a consequence. I think we have to, one thing that Western values are about the rational investigation of accusations and the protection of the rights of the accused. And when the accused is a nation, as well, and not only an individual, I think the same thing applies.
Was there a question on this side?
Thank you, Professors. Andrew Woodhouse from the Potts Point Heritage Society. I note you talk about the weaponisation of history. Could I ask you to just clarify what you mean by that term and how you think it can be alleviated?
I think we have to accept that history has always been the weaponization of history, or the let's say, the harnessing of history, or the attempt to use history for political purposes, is one of the oldest cultural activities recorded by mankind. Indeed, the main purpose of studying history for most of its existence as an activity has been in order to use it for political or other purposes, either to glorify or to attack. What I mean by it is when you start to think, or when you start to behave in a way that means that you're not in fact trying to understand or investigate the past as a way of understanding more about human nature, let's say, but you simply are going to use it as a form of propaganda. And therefore, truth is not what counts. It's simply the usable narrative that you are going to deploy. And you're going to ignore evidence that does not support the view that you want to put forward. I mean, this is not, as I say, this is not new. It was very common. Well, the most recent example of it being used wholesale was by Marxist history, and it's still used, of course, in many countries in which history is a monopoly of the state. China and Russia are obvious ones, and as Orwell famously put it, "He who controls the present controls the past. He who controls the past controls the future." And the use of the power of the present to manipulate our understanding of the past in order to gain ideological power in the future is what I'm talking about. So an Orwellian concept of the abuse of history.
Thank you, Robert. Erica, there was another hand, I think. This.
Thanks very much, Paul Dale, interested citizen. Really appreciate your talk tonight. You have talked about being objective and rational, and I think that is so important, particularly for the historian. But the late Sir Roger Scruton also talked about love of home as being very important. How do we be objective about our past, but also love our past in a way, love our home, our nation? It seems to me that those two things might stand in some degree of tension, but it seems to me that it's very important to deal with the issues we're facing today.
I'm pretty sure I heard Roger Scruton say once that, the famous American toast, "My country, right or wrong," had been generally misunderstood. What it meant is that you felt a loyalty and affection for your country, in spite of things it might have done that were wrong. You were not supporting the things it had done that were wrong, but you, as in the case of your family, you would forgive and not forget, but try to remedy. I mean, I don't think on the whole we hate our families or our countries because of bad things they may have done in the past. There may be, an example that's often given is that of Germany after the Second World War. And I think that is probably the most extreme case in which a whole culture came very close to repudiating itself on the grounds of the awful things that had been done in its name. And you might say, well, in that case, what was required was a very serious consideration of what in German culture and German history had led to the disaster and the crimes of the Nazi period. But it seemed to me it would be regrettable, as I think has been the case in Germans I've known, who've said, this Beethoven, this Mozart, we don't like all that stuff now. It's too German. Wagner, of course, especially. I mean, I think you can be aware of what is to be deplored and removed in your culture, without thinking that the whole of that culture is to be rejected. And whether you like it or not, you're part of a community, or at least most of us are. Our former Prime Minister, Theresa May, of whom I'm not a huge admirer, I have to admit, made a speech in which she said, people who claim to be citizens of the world are often really citizens of nowhere. And this was very much criticized, especially by people who thought of themselves as citizens of the world. But I think she was right, you know, to say you're a citizen of the world is fine. You know, you can be very broad in your interests and in your sympathies and in your friendships. But the fact is you have both rights and duties to the country in which you live. And it's too easy to say, oh, well, you know, I really don't like, you know, a lot of people said this after Brexit, I'm really ashamed of Britain, I'm fed up with Britain, it's an awful place now. Well, you can't do that unless you're going to become a sort of free rider on everybody else. You're still going to have the benefits of citizenship. You should also accept the duties. And I don't think that's changed, even by the fact that your country in the past may have done dreadful things. Indeed, the fact that it may have done dreadful things in the past should perhaps be even more of a motive for you to get involved in making sure that such things don't happen again. I mean, and I'm very glad I'm not Russian, but if I were a concerned Russian citizen, I would not say, you know, I'm giving up. I hope I'd say, I have to try and do something to improve this country, because it's the country of myself and my family, and that's how it is.
Thank you very much, Professor. My name's Millie, and I'm studying to be a primary teacher. My question for you is that you shared that you have the hope that your organisation will reflect the majority of public opinion, and I think that polling on many major public discussions indicates that you're probably right, and even today, as we anticipate one in Australia, many polls show that the opinions you don't hear a lot could be the ones that a lot of people have. So I was wondering if you have any suggestions on empowering this silent majority, because the whole safety in numbers thing definitely doesn't seem to be holding up. Thank you.
No. I think, and I don't know if it's true in Australia, but it's certainly true in Britain, there does seem to be a great generational gulf. You know, the under 35s often think very differently. Again, it's not the first time. I mean, one historian said, I remember this, he said the generation that grew up in the 1960s was probably more unlike their parents than any other generation in the whole of human history. And, you know, we're always going through these great changes. But I do think that people like you have a huge responsibility to, at least to teach children not to believe everything that they're told, not to believe that the fashionable ideas are necessarily true, and often to trust their parents and their grandparents, or at least to listen to them. I mean, I'm afraid to say I've heard often people say, I mean, in fact, I have no children, but I've heard people with children and grandchildren to a worrying extent say to me, I can't talk about any of this to my children or grandchildren. You know, they just walk out of the room. And that is worrying, that's very worrying. And I suppose I'd say I wonder to what extent teachers are responsible for this. And so it's really necessary for some teachers not to go along with this. But, you know, I wish you all the best. And that's why I think I did say this is partly a political struggle, because there are people who are taking over institutions and using them in a way I think is damaging. And those who agree really have to do something as citizens to say we're not willing to allow this. I mean, there have been cases in Britain, again, I hope this is not true in Australia, in which parents have been told they have no right to know what their children are being taught at school. That seems to me to be dreadful and very alarming.
Erica, there's a question just in the aisle over here.
My name's Jill Curtin. I'd like your comments, please, on the return of artefacts from museums and what role, I mean, museums are there to educate, so what role that's going to have now if the artefacts are coming back?
Yes, that's a great question. And I expect I'm probably going to slightly evade it by saying I think it depends on the particular case. We all know that there are museums which have vast amounts of artifacts that they never show. There's a case recently of the British Museum that you may have read about, the scandal in which it turned out that one of its curators had been selling stuff on eBay. So they had so much that nobody knew what they'd got, and they hadn't got any record of it. They'd been flogging it on eBay. He'd been put in charge of the Elgin marbles, by the way, but those, as far as I know, are still there. But I mean, I think the museums in the past have often said we are willing to lend or to give material to other museums that need it, and I don't see there can be any objection to that, especially at a time in which the records of these artifacts can be kept for scholarly study. What I objected to with the Benin bronzes issue, which I referred to, which I got slightly obsessed by, was it seemed to me that it was being done entirely for the wrong reasons, and it was being used in order to create a certain view of the past which was untrue. In other words, what the impression being given was this was a terrible crime against civilization by rampaging imperial troops, burning down the capital of the wonderful kingdom of Benin, deposing its monarchs, stealing its treasures, and flogging them off back in Britain. And the truth is not that. The truth is that this was a dreadful kingdom, and well, it wasn't actually extinguished, but the prevention of its traditional culture, which included mass human sacrifice, was a great benefit to its people. And if you were to say, look, we've got a lot of these Benin bronzes, we're happy to give you some of them, but we don't regard our possession of them as being proof of any crime, then okay, fair enough. I don't think I objected to it being used as a kind of means of propaganda. By the way, the British colonial authorities, before Nigeria became independent, assembled quite a large collection of Benin bronzes, including from the British Museum, for a museum in Nigeria. Now, I'm told by people who know that many of these have disappeared. One of them is, in fact, in Windsor Castle, I believe, because the then ruler of Nigeria, whose name I've temporarily forgotten, wanted to give a present to the Queen. So he went to the museum, stole, in fact, from the National Museum, a choice Benin bronze, brought it along to Buckingham Palace and gave it to the Queen. It's still in royal possession, and I would be in favour of giving that back, because I don't think the King has any right to have it. But the ones that are in other museums, I don't think are necessarily to be returned, or at least one should look very carefully at what is being returned, where it's being returned to whom it's being returned, and why it's being returned.
That's great. Thank you.
And I don't think the Elgin marble should go back to Athens, but that's just
your views.
Thank you for your lecture, Professor Toombs. I was wondering, we spoke about the conception of the simplified conception of the West as a genocidal colonial empire. What are your thoughts about, is it a simplification to call the West a patriarchal, tyrannical empire where women's place is kind of reduced in that way?
Well, I don't know really. I didn't mention, I thought I was being rather provocative in mentioning feminism, the feminist meta-narrative, as one of the things that's undermined the idea of the West. Because if you believe that the whole of Western history is essentially one of the oppression of women, and that's sort of what it's all about, then it's quite difficult to say, well, in many ways it was rather a good system. I mean, I think the feminist meta-narrative is a meta-narrative like other meta-narratives. I myself am a little skeptical about women as a whole being subjected by men as a whole to positions of inferiority. Men had to die in wars. Men often died younger. Many women were extremely powerful and wealthy. So I think anything that simplifies the past and creates a sort of caricature of it, I think is to be at least treated with some skepticism. I say that as a sincere feminist.
Yes.
Good evening, and thank you, Professor Toombs, for the lecture. My name's Elijah Harris. I'm a postgraduate student in the ACU Western Civilization program. My question, building on some of the things we've already been talking about with the weaponization of history, and with the Canadian incident where they overestimated the population figures. How can everyday people reading works of history or perhaps an online article be discerning with what they're reading? Whether what they're reading may be an instance of this weaponization of history or may actually be valid beyond just looking at the conclusions and whether they say the right thing about the good guys or the bad guys?
Well, I think that's a very good question. I think it is the most worrying thing in many ways, because most people, of course, are not going to read historical monographs, or they won't know which the right ones to read are, if you see what I mean. We tried to produce a reading list of, people said, well, what should I read? But most people get their ideas of history from television programs, works of fiction, and it's very difficult to know how you influence that, because the people producing these works are often themselves part of the let's say the activist. All right, I'll use the word woke because it's quick. The woke elite. So I think the only way is to keep saying, well, what this program was wrong. Write to the ABC, or we've written to the BBC and say, what you said there was not true. They usually take absolutely no notice. But at least maybe you can make them think. I mean, I thought when we started History Reclaimed, one thing we could do was to make people think that they would not necessarily get away with saying things that were not true, that they would have people badgering them and saying, you made a mistake here, or what you said was not right. So I think if a lot of people do that, it might have an effect. But, it's a huge uphill struggle.
Erica, Karen Kuhlman had a question. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Professor Toombs. A very interesting overview of so many issues. And I wondered, when listening to you, whether really what we're seeing is a lack of academic rigour and investigation. I'm just, as a consumer of history, it's all about the discipline and the evidence and the assessment of that, and you can put that together and create a thesis. But it's there to be critiqued by others, and perhaps I wonder what your thoughts are about whether or not we are critiquing what is put forward, and whether that is not being properly assessed and analysed because of a fear of offending somebody.
Yes, I think you're right. I mean, you can find lots of academics who'd say, well, look at him, he's just an unrepresented minority of the older generation. Most people are very happy with the sort of history that's been written. It's progressive, it's new, it's cutting edge, and so on. Now, I would say that you're right. It is often not rigorous. And I mean, I could, if I were not afraid of being sued, I could mention a few names here. But we are going to be publishing something on reputable historians who are saying things that they ought to know are not true, or at least, and the people who are approving the publication of their work should know that they're not true. But the fact is, there is now such a tide of groupthink, if you can have a tide of groupthink, that people just say, well, of course this is fantastic stuff, this is wonderful, and what you do about that, I don't know. Except, fashions often change sooner or later. But I think this one has a long way to go yet. Another thing is that the academic profession, although we might like to believe it was made up of people who are pure intellectuals, who are, as honest as the day is long, are also careerists, and they know which side their bread is buttered on. And they know what's going to get them research grants, and they know what's going to get them promotion, and they know what's going to get their works published. And they will go with the flow. In many cases. I mean, yeah, I think no more to be said, really.
Yes. Well, there is.
Thanks so much for a really interesting talk. A question that's very relevant to Australia at the moment. We're going to a poll next month. Is the rewriting of history in our constitution, is that a repudiation of history or a correction of history?
When I came here, I made a firm resolution that I would not say anything about the Australian referendum.
Nor need you.
Australians have to decide whether they think this is going to be a way of, healing the nation's wounds or if it's going to make them more inflamed. It's not for me to say, and I won't say it.
No, I think that's fair. Well, I think we probably have to call it a night. This has been a wonderful talk, and very kind of you to give us so much time for questions as well,
Pleasure.
Robert.
Pleasure.
But I think we need to let this man have a break and a drink. So perhaps I can draw this to a close with just a huge expression of appreciation from all of us, Professor Toombs, for this
my pleasure.
Terrific talk. It's been absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you very much.